Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to be talking about Chapter 15, which is all about authority and the state. So let's look for a second at the state and punishment. So the state, meaning the individual state or the United States as a whole, has the ability to punish individuals. But how does the state punish said individuals? Well, Michael Foucault is a sociologist who said that the modern society moved from punishing the body in the Middle Ages via physical torture to punishing the soul, which we see today in incarceration, where some people, depending on the crime that they commit, can face solitary confinement. So states have misdemeanors and criminal offenses, and the federal government has criminal offenses that you can make. With both of these, whether it's state or federal crimes, typically how they are determined to be either a misdemeanor or a criminal offense often comes, the lesser is misdemeanor and the more punishable offense is a crime. Depending on the level of misdemeanor or crime, that's typically going to involve things like with misdemeanors, having a fine and possible community service, and even taking an anger management class or going to detox and rehab to work through substance use issues. When it comes to crimes, you're typically going to find that in many cases, they typically not only have a restitution, so you have to pay back, or you have to pay a retribution, a certain amount of money that, is placed on the crime, or payback, for example, if you stole money, as well as jail time. When we still think about the state and how they punish, there are still state-sanctioned shamings that exist. For example, in Ohio, if they issue a yellow license plate, that shows that this person who's driving has been convicted of drunk driving. So even though you have, admitted to an offense, or you've been found guilty of an offense and you have now been charged with this crime and you're found guilty of it and you do everything you need to do to work through it, you can still be shamed publicly. When we look at the types of legitimate authority, let's look at what it is, what authority actually is, and how we can look at it. Authority is the justifiable right to exercise power. And there are three different types of authority: charismatic, traditional, and legal rational. Charismatic authority is based on the personal appeal of an individual leader. Traditional authority is based on appeals to the past or a long-established way of doing things. And legal rational authority is based on legal and personal rules that are based on routinization and rationalization. When something is routinized, this is essentially where you are either establishing or reducing a routine. So in this case, we're looking to reduce the routine. So for example, if the government wants to reduce the routine, they're going to place much stricter punishments if you commit a crime of murder. Rationalized is essentially a replacement of traditions, values, and emotions as motivators for behavior in society with concepts that are based in rationality and reason. So when we look at this from a sociological perspective, so this example would look at how people will just accept that there are injustices towards people who are Black, especially young Black men, being for drug-related offenses, being incarcerated, simply because, well, just because they're Black, they probably are guilty of it. The other side could also be that the Black community says, even though we're being targeted, it doesn't matter because we're still going to continue to be targeted because we're Black. So they have rationalized how their physical characteristic of this color of their skin will continue to marginalize them. When we look at the different types of authority, let's talk about examples of them. So an example of a charismatic leader that many people have identified is President Obama. When you look at a traditional authority, a lot of people say that President Trump is based on this, especially with his slogan for MAGA, Make America Great Again. We look at a legal rational example. A great example of this, again, that legal rational, is that people have elected other individuals into positions in which they're running for. A bureaucracy is a legal rational organization or mode of administration that governs by rules and roles it emphasizes. Meritocracy. Meritocracy is a society where status and mobility are based on individual attributes, ability, and achievement. It utilizes specialization, which is the process of breaking up work into specific delimited tasks, of which Taylorism is an example. Taylorism represents this organizational form without any notion. It's a structure that's unlike other organizational models that's available. So this is essentially defined as how we take bureaucracy and look at it as the structure of control. So essentially, when you think about bureaucracy as a legal rational organization, it uses this specialization. Again, that's the process of breaking up work into these specific delimited tasks, and that those tasks give people a certain level of control. When we look at the Milgram experiment, this is by far one of the most poignant aspects that we can look at to show how people are obedient to authority. The Milgram experiment tested people to see how far they would go in obeying an authority figure. In short, Milgram set up this experiment where he had two groups of people. They were divided and could not essentially see each other. What ended up happening was that they would look at they would take the one group of people and they would connect them to a machine that would shock them. And the other group would be the ones delivering the shocks. Based on the responses that the person who was wearing the machine to shock them, how they would answer, would determine how the level of shock would go. They were being coached to permit more and more shocks. And the higher level the shocks, the more it impacted the physical system. So they wanted to see, were people influenced by others? The results showed that obedience to authority or someone in a presence of authority is a very powerful form of social control that can make quote unquote ordinary people do unspeakable things. The next section of our book looks at authority, legitimacy, and the state. Per Max Weber, power is the ability to carry out one's will despite resistance and domination. It is the probability that a command with specific content will be obeyed by a given group of people. Weber also differentiated between domination by economic power and domination by authority, which is the willing obedience of the ruled to the commands of a legitimate authority. Weber defined the state, the ultimate example of domination by authority, as, quote, a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. Coercion is the use of force, as opposed to authority, to get others to do what you want. Once a person or institution decides to use physical coercion, it loses all legitimate authority, which is called the paradox of authority. Max Weber continues to talk about what a state is, saying that, again, the state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. So essentially, Weber's talking in many ways about forms of coercion. Most European states developed over the course of hundreds of years through a long series of fights over territorial boundaries, but many countries in the world have been somewhat arbitrarily, quote unquote, produced through colonization and subsequent decisions by the influence of the international state system and the United Nations. The welfare state is a system in which the state is responsible for the welfare of its citizens. There are numerous theories about the origins of the welfare state, including the logistics of industrialism thesis, neo-Marxist theories, and statist theories. Sociologist C.H. Marshall identified 3 different types of rights that you have. Citizenship rights, again, they fall under these citizenship rights are the rights that you have being part of the state. They are civil rights, political rights, and social rights. A civil right is a guaranteed personal freedom without the state interfering. A political right are rights to participate in politics, hold office, or vote. And social rights guarantee protection by the state. So a civil right would be that you have the right to utilize a service within the state as long as you are a citizen of that state. So that could be filing unemployment claims or using a transportation system. A political right, again, is where you have the right to run for office or to vote for a candidate. A social right is that you have certain freedoms. For example, in the United States, you have the freedom of speech. That's our First Amendment. You will be protected by those rights as part of the First Amendment. Many of these things also have limitations. And those limitations, for example, especially with social rights, where it says that you have the right to the freedom of speech, which is the First Amendment. Unless that freedom of speech causes mass harm or death, then it can be refuted. But you still have the right to say what you want. There's a difference between saying and acting. According to Stephen Luke's, when we look at power, right, he describes 3 dimensions of power. The first dimension has to do with outright conflict over something that results in one side, quote unquote, winning. The second dimension has to do with power that is so imposing that it seems pointless to resist. And the third dimension has to do with the averting conflict altogether by limiting people's choices or influencing their preferences. An example of Stephen Luke's first dimension is that when you look at this conflict over something, there's one side that's winning. Depending on your political lens, especially with what's going on in our current society, you may say that Republicans are on top or conservatives are on top, or you may say that liberals are on top or Democrats are on top. But whenever there's a clash, there's someone who ultimately prevails, they win. When you look at an example for the second dimension, for many people, when we look at Democratic nominations for presidency, you started off with a field of 20, you're now down to a field of 1. And typically that one person, and especially in today's climate, is someone that is not very well admired by many people who adhere to liberal points of view or who identify as Democrat and even independent. So it's problematic in that this one side is so powerful that they are now that one person that's left. So for many people, you either jump on the bandwagon for this individual or they just don't vote. The third dimension, an example of this can be where we right now have a primary two-party system, but we also have other parties. But the parties, Republican and Democrat, they have such a stance of power in our society that they essentially limit choices for people. You either pick for Republican or Democrat. You may find an independent here or there. You very often don't see a Tea Party candidate or a Green Party candidate. is typically Democrat and Republican. By limiting it to a two-party system, even though we have at least 5 parties, by limiting it to 2 parties, you are limiting people's choices and influencing their preferences. Take a step back for a second. In addition to Stephen Luke's, Kenneth Arrow, who's another sociologist, he looks at the impossibility theorem, which shows how difficult it is for people to express their true first choice desires when selecting between more than 2 alternatives. When there are more than 2 choices, strategic voting quickly comes into play. To avoid this and to have more control over the outcome, authorities will try to limit the set of choices to 2 and then influence voters to make the quote-unquote right choice. We saw that recently where the field of Democratic nominees went from 20 to 2 between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. And ultimately, Bernie Sanders, he has stepped back to reevaluate his campaign and may even drop out. So people are pushing for Biden, but it was down to pick the right 2. You know, both of them are Democrats. Both Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden had very different ideologies as far as what it meant to be Democrat, what it meant to be a liberal. So there was an influence, especially by the media and within the Democratic Party, to pick the quote-unquote right choice. We also have this notion of hard and soft power. Hard power is the use of military or economic force to influence behavior. Soft power is the use of cultural or ideological means to influence behavior. Thomas Hobbes, another sociologist, believed that the state of nature is chaos and that people submit to authority or the state as a means of survival. John Locke argued that people live in peace and equality in the state of nature, but that they ultimately submit to authority, the state, for financial reasons. For example, to help iron out disagreements about property. Using game theory, other scholars have argued that the masses, in resisting the domination of the elites with the threat of revolution, have a brief window of opportunity when they can try to change the distribution of political power to bring about democratization. Which leads us to the difference between a democracy and a dictatorship. Democracy is a system of government in which the power lies with the people. These people vote and participate in the political system. So you have the candidates who run for office and you have people who vote for the candidates to put them in office. By putting them in office, again, kind of going back to bureaucracy for a little bit, this is where we give that person the specialization to carry out the task of representing that area. And again, tying that into Taylorism, in which this is now you give them the control to carry out those actions in which you voted them in. We look at a dictatorship. This is a system of government in which participation in politics is limited to a select few or maybe even just one person. In today's society, some notable dictators you find are in Afghanistan, in China, Cuba, Egypt, many parts of Africa, Iran, Iraq, Libya, Nicaragua, North Korea, Oman, Qatar, Cambodia, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Turkey, as well as the United Arab Emirates. The collective action problem is simply that it's harder to organize larger groups than smaller ones because less accountability exists in larger groups, and individuals in larger groups may find it easier to slack off and not do their part. Altruism is an action that benefits a group but does not directly benefit the individual performing the action. So who rules in the United States? In the United States, power is shared between 3 branches of government, as well as between the federal government and the many state governments. In the United States, The three branches are the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. So the legislative branch makes the laws. They are the House of Representatives and the Senate members. They are the branch that can declare laws as being unconstitutional. You then have the judicial branch, which evaluates laws. And this branch of government initiates and approves laws. This includes the Supreme Court and other federal appellate courts. You finally have the executive branch. They carry out the laws. They are essentially, who do cabinet members report to? Well, that's the president, the vice president, and other members of the cabinet. Ultimately, the federal government in the United States supersedes the state government. But the state governments, whereas in the United States we have a president, the state governments have governors. The governors report to the president and other members of their cabinet to report about things that are going on. For example, with coronavirus, you have the governors who are working with their state departments of health. The governors are communicating to the president about what their needs are, and the state departments of health are communicating with the federal Department of Health in order to make sure, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, in order to antiquate all this information and to communicate more effectively about what they're seeing and what needs are. When we look at political parties, a political party is an organization that wants to gain power in government. Typically, that's done by backing a candidate who shares the same beliefs. In the United States, the major parties are the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. When you look at minor parties, these are parties that are not typically represented in many or nationwide in elections. This includes the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, the Tea Party, and the Constitution Party. When you look at an interest group is an organization that seeks to gain power in government and influence policies without its representative or a lobbyist seeking election. An example of interest groups in the United States include now the National Organization for Women, as well as the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts of America. When you look at political participation, something for us to think about is that political participation is an activity that has the intent or effect of influencing governmental action. Studies consistently show great differences in rates and types of political participation across social groups in the United States, with those at the top of the socioeconomic ladder participating more and those at the bottom less. The civic volunteerism model of political participation focuses on individual level traits that affect how politically active a person is. Some scholars reject this model and point to the American party system and political elites as being responsible for low political participation by instituting or being slow to do away with barriers that hinder citizen involvement. I hope that this was helpful for you today. I would love for you in the comment section below to comment for 1 point of extra credit about one way in which you see politics in the United States influencing a field in sociology. So how do politics influence the media? How do politics influence our culture? How do politics influence family? How do politics influence racial groups, or how do they try to bring different races into actually participating into politics? Leave your answer in the comment section below for 1 point added to your final grade. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me. Remember to be kind to yourself and to others, and to work smarter, not harder. Until next time, have a great one, y'all.